let's continue our investigation into how the event loop processes events. We've learned that when you pass a callback into a function, like setTimeout, when that timer completes, the callback gets put on something called a callback queue, or event queue, to be executed at a later time. Now, what does the event loop do with our queue of callbacks? Well, I'll let you in on a secret. There's no one callback queue. We do have queues of callbacks that keep track of which tasks need to be run, but if you look deep into the workings of the event loop, you'll see there's actually several different queues. Each one handles a different phase of the event loop. Whoa, what's this phase idea that I just introduced? Each phase of the event loop is responsible for different types of operations. There's 4 main phases of the event loop. Each of these stages is responsible for a different category of operations that the event loop processes. There's one for timers, one for input-output events, one for setImmediate, and one for closed callbacks. Each of these phases has their own queue of callbacks that are executed during that phase. A callback for setTimeout would go on the timer queue, while a callback for a file system operation, well, that's input-output, so it would go on the I/O queue, which is responsible for all asynchronous input-output operations. This I/O queue is also known as the poll queue. We'll go through each of these phases in just a second. But before we get there, we need to understand this concept of timers. There's 3 types of timers that we have in Node. You might have seen some of these. We have setTimeout, we have setInterval, and we have setImmediate. We've already seen setTimeout in action, and setInterval is very similar, except it sets a function to be executed many times repeatedly, with function calls separated by a minimum of the delay that you pass in as a parameter. Rather than executing your callback once, like setTimeout, setInterval loops that function on an interval. setImmediate is a special kind of timer. It sets the callback that you pass in to be executed as soon as possible on the event loop. In theory, this means it's going to be executed immediately. But the truth is, setImmediate isn't so immediate. We'll really see this by visualizing the different phases of the event loop. Let's find out how the event loop flows through all of its different phases. When the event loop first starts executing, on the first iteration of our loop, the first phase starts getting processed. The event loop begins by going through all of our timer callbacks. These are callbacks that were passed into setTimeout and setInterval. The event loop goes through the timer's callback queue and checks if there's any functions for it to execute, functions for timers that have completed. once it's processed all of the functions in the timers phase, it moves on to the next phase. We're still in the first iteration of the event loop, or what we call the first tick of the event loop. And we're now dealing with all of our input-output callbacks. This is the majority of all your callbacks in a real-life Node application. It includes things like all your network and file operations, but basically anything that doesn't fit in the other phases goes here. So if your code is done reading a file, the callback for that read operation will be pushed onto the I/O phase callback queue, and it will be executed in this phase. Next up, we have the set immediate phase. Remember, set immediate is a special kind of timer, like set timeout and set interval, that instead executes after the I/O phase. As you can see, functions passed into set immediate actually execute after those passed into timers, like, for example, set timeout. It's called set immediate because it runs immediately after any I/O operations have finished executing, and before another cycle of the event loop starts. Before we move on to that next tick, there's one more phase, the close callbacks phase. This is for when you close a file or a network connection, and you have a callback that executes when that connection is closed. That's what goes in this last phase. When all of the close callbacks have been processed, the event loop cycle begins again. And it goes through this list of different functions that it needs to execute. So it first checks the timers, asking, are there any timer callback functions to execute? If yes, it runs them. And when it's done, it asks the I/O callback queue, are there any functions for me to execute? Does the callback queue for this phase have something for me to process? If not, or once it's done processing, it moves on to the next phase, and so on, until we start a new tick of that event loop. Now, there are a couple of other phases in the event loop, like the idle and prepare phase, but that's only used internally by Node. Our JavaScript can't do any operations there, so these phases aren't really important to us. The 4 phases we see here are those that really capture the behavior of the event loop and how it interacts with JavaScript. By going through all these different types of functions in the different queues, the event loop makes sure that all the functions that make up your asynchronous Node programs eventually execute. And that's it. Node combines this event loop along with the V8 engine and libuv to bring JavaScript to the server, allowing us to create all the websites and servers and applications that we can possibly imagine. Good stuff. I'll see you in the next one.